Good morning, Charleston Bible Church.
Morning.
Be honest. Any Bluey fans in the house? Okay, I'm feeling it right here. I love this. All right, Bluey. Does anybody? Do we know what Bluey is? It's a kid's cartoon. It comes out of Australia. It's actually legitimately one of the best children's cartoons I have ever seen. I do have children, so I kind of have an excuse to watch it. But even if you don't, you would probably get something out of it. It shows a nuclear family doing life together. Now, they are dogs, but they're doing life together, and they're dealing with situations, and it's just sort of a delightful slice of what family can be, even in a silly animated cartoon version. But I want you to listen to this. Recently in the New York Times, pop culture critic Amanda Hess argued that the immensely popular Australian children's cartoon Bluey is problematic. According to Hess, the cartoon offers an over-idealistic portrayal of parenting, especially of fathers. Not only is Bluey's puppy dad Bandit a good father, he is a fantasy, one crafted to appeal to adults as much as to children. Bandit seems omnipresent in the 7-minute episodes. Hess complains too often playing with his daughters and doing housework. The dad is doing too good of a job. This is what this pop culture critic is arguing. He represents a parent freed from drudgery, one whose central responsibility is delighting his kids. The reason why a portrayal of dads is a bad thing, a positive portrayal of dads is a bad thing, has something to do with what former President George W. Bush once called the soft bigotry of low expectations. Hess is not really arguing that cartoon dads shouldn't be good dads, but that if they are too good, the real-life dads might feel guilty, and real-life kids with absent or abusive dads might feel worse. In other words, if everyone can't meet that high standard, we're going to lower the standard. This dad doesn't treat his children like objects or status symbols or constant irritants, as items on a bucket list or obstacles to freedom, prosperity, and autonomy. According to Hess, the problem with Bluey is that it never portrays the drudgery of parenthood, peddling instead some irrational idea that a parent should delight in his kids and delight his kids. In Hess's critique, it's not possible for a dad to feel annoyed, bored, and pulled in many different directions at once, but still choose to play goofy games with his kids because he knows at some level just how important that is for these children. So the main point, this cartoon is critiqued for showing a good dad and a nuclear family doing life in an enjoyable way. That's a critique. If you've been keeping up with the news, you've also noticed there are some things happening, especially in Canada, with this idea of medical assistance in dying. They call it dying with dignity. It says this, and by the way, some of these excerpts are coming from Breakpoint Commentaries that's put out by the Colson Center, John Stone Street. And it says this, a 27-year-old woman in Canada has just been given permission to end her life, not because she suffers from a terminal ailment, but because she has autism. Though her father attempted to stop his daughter from accessing medical assistance in dying in court, a judge ruled that not providing medical assistance in dying would cause her irreparable harm, as if death for some is less harmful than living. No one should be told, especially by agents of the state, that they are better off dead. The Hippocratic oath of do no harm has long guided Western medicine, but it is now in many nations being redefined or even dismissed. The main point there, the idea of life having innate value is rapidly disappearing. You know, abortion leads us to the same conclusion, right? As we watch the abortion debate continue, with the rise of prenatal screening tests across Europe and the United States, listen to this, the number of babies born with Down syndrome has significantly decreased. But not because it is less common, it's because it is more common for parents to opt for abortion when they realize that their child has Down syndrome when they get that scan in utero. No country probably has done that more, I hesitate to say successfully, than Iceland. Since they started mandating prenatal screenings in Iceland in the early 2000s, close to 100% of women who get a diagnosis of Down syndrome with their baby choose to abort that baby. Another issue that we see rising up in our current cultural moment is transgender affirming care and the passage of bills like Title IX. So again, earlier this month, the UK's, well, this was a couple months ago, the UK's National Health Service released the Cass Review, a report that urged Great Britain to pump the brakes. If you haven't read the Cass Review, or at least kind of a summary of it, it is a wonderful research portfolio of respected doctors that have said, hey, we're going way too far in affirming transgender care and transitioning and hormone treatment for children. Way too far. So England has pumped the brakes on it. In the United States, there is no brake pedal, at least not yet. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Education issued its new Title IX regulations, which require public schools to really facilitate this pipeline from school to sterilization. According to the Biden administration, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, now this is a while back, requires schools to treat students who suffer or claim to suffer from gender dysphoria as though they were the opposite sex. The Cass Review really does argue that this is not helpful. This does count as medical intervention, and that's a problem for children. But it says this. For starters, a boy who says he's a girl must be granted access to the girls' bathroom or locker room. And because that administration required no documentation to affirm gender identity and refused to really define it at all, a boy could really identify as a girl fluidly. And some days they feel like a girl, some days they feel like a boy, and they get to have the benefits of either one whenever they feel like it. In addition, teachers and students must refer to a gender dysphoric child by her or his preferred pronouns and alternative name. But listen to this. If a child says she doesn't want her parents to know, this law insists that the schools will be totally compliant with federal law by keeping it a secret, offering counseling, trying to get a pipeline to medical services. And that is dangerous for our children. So, the critique and breakdown of the nuclear family, medical assistance in dying, abortion and the new eugenics movement, Title IX and the damage done by gender-affirming care for gender dysphoric children. Y'all, our world is a mess. I hope that this has been an illustration of that. If you're anything like me, you have had moments where you've been listening to the news or watching something, maybe an article, and you just get to a point where you kind of mentally throw up your hands and go, I don't get it. I don't understand how we've arrived at this place, this cultural moment, where everything seems so bankrupt of morality. I've been so discouraged at times that I feel apathy. I don't know what I can do. I don't know if there's anything I can do, so I'm just going to kind of step back. And I got to tell you, I've been convicted about that. Because the Christian's role is never to step back from society. It is to engage with our culture in a redemptive way. So before we can answer the question, what can I do? That is a part of what we expect out of this class over the next 8 weeks. It is going to be important to understand how we've arrived at this point. It won't make sense to us unless we can really nail down what is the line of thought, the trajectory that has brought us to this moment where we can have articles written about how terrible Bluey is because of the good family that is portrayed by that show. So in this class, we are setting out to learn about the development of Western worldviews from the first century Rome until now. And so just a few goals. I want you to have a mindset for where we're aiming with the class. So we're going to hope, and by the way, Michael Mott and I are going to be teaming on this. You'll see him up here in a few minutes as well. We hope that a participant in this class will be able to better understand the development of Western thought from the first century to the 21st century, because ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And we see that really clearly in the history of Western thought. We also want our participants to be able to succinctly explain what a worldview is. It's not a term that's used very much in our culture, except for in the church, but maybe not even that much in the church anymore. So we want everybody to be able to very clearly and distinctly know what is a worldview. How can I discuss worldview? And then once we know what a worldview is, we would like to emphasize being able to evaluate worldviews from a biblical perspective. We would like participants to wherever you are right now, to go up a level in being able to look at TV shows, movies, music, media that we consume, and ask really important worldview questions of those types of media. It's become kind of normal in my house. My kids, they'll get tired of it after a while, but after we watch a movie, I regularly ask questions like, who was the bad guy? Why was he a bad guy? Who was the good guy? What made him good? Who won? Why? And then the question, what do you think that movie was trying to teach us? Because they are trying to teach us. There's always a worldview component underneath a movie, a TV show, a book. There's always something there, even if it's not intentional. It's always there. And so we want to be able to identify and evaluate because worldviews are caught more often than they are taught. And we'd like to flip that. We want to teach worldview in a constructive way in this class. And then lastly, we would like to be able to help you identify and pursue actionable steps toward entering into this mission of redeeming this culture, of stepping into culture instead of stepping back from culture and redeeming this culture. For a long time, Christian institutions have emphasized the personal aspect of faith. Jesus is your personal Savior, right? It's a personal decision, and that's accurate and good. But it's not the complete view of what Christian faith is. It is personal, but it is not private. And so we want to look at how do we push into culture. You know, to be born again is to be redeemed from a life of vanity and to be invited into God's plan for redemption. We get redeemed and we get to be part of His plan for redemption for this place. So Paul says that God has crafted believers, crafted them carefully so that we would be able to enter into the good works that He has prepared for us, bringing a fallen world more progressively in line and in light in the knowledge of Jesus. So our hope is that as we talk about things that have happened in culture and worldview over the last 2,000 years, and especially how Christians have been faithful lights in the midst of dark times, our hope is that we would hear a call to be part of that movement, that our faith would be personal, but it would not be private. So we'll be looking to highlight ways that believers can engage in our cultural moment. Just a very little bit of background for us, y'all. I recently went through this Colson Fellows program, and this class is kind of birthed out of that. Anybody familiar with Chuck Colson? The name sounds familiar. He was a part of President Nixon's administration. He was called Nixon's hatchet man. He was a rough dude. Some of the phone calls that they've recorded about things that he suggested, like firebombing the Brookings Institution so that they could steal sensitive political documents while the firefighters were putting it out. He was a hardcore guy. There was nothing that was going to get in the way of his political ambitions for this Nixon administration. And then Watergate happened. And he was in the midst of trials, and a friend gave him C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And Chuck Colson's life was miraculously transformed by Jesus. And he pled guilty to something that he believed he actually had done. He said, I did this crime, I will do this time. And that was part of his Christian conviction. And he went on, after spending some time in federal prison, to start the prison fellowship ministry. Because he saw lots of abuses in the prison system and really a dead-end route for people that were in prison. And he said, this is a part of our culture that is broken, that needs to be redeemed. And so he stepped into it. And through many different organizations that he has started, the Colson Fellows program is one that trains people in Christian worldview and Christian engagement in our culture. And so this class comes largely from that 10-month program that I was in. And I'm happy to talk more with you about that. If that sounds like something you're interested in, read it. It's about a 10-month program. You read 12 to 13 books. There's a monthly cohort meeting. You can think of it kind of like a graduate class in Christian apologetics and worldview. And I can say it's been a very, very encouraging and challenging experience for me in terms of looking at my Christian faith and saying, how does this affect the culture around me? This book, Why You Think the Way You Do, is a major part of this class, and it's going to be a kind of a foundational text for us. The last thing I want to point out to you is the Breakpoint podcasts. If you do get interested in the material of this class, as we go through talking about worldviews, I would strongly encourage you to subscribe. They do a podcast. They also do just a little emailed newsletter. And if you subscribe, they'll send it to you around lunchtime every day. It's probably a 5 to 7 minute read. but it is expertly done, and it discusses how Christians are engaging in worldview issues. They're engaging in this culture, and it gives very good perspective on current events, news events that are happening right now. So I'd strongly encourage that if you get kind of interested in the topic of this class. So for today, let's talk about what we want to accomplish just today. We're looking at the questions of what is a worldview, and then what was the prevailing worldview of first century Rome. So Michael Mott is going to actually go ahead and step into that and give us a little bit of a primer on the concept of worldview, and then take us a bit further towards understanding the worldview of Rome.
All right, I'd like everyone to turn to their nearest neighbor. Hopefully you know who it is. Look them in the eyes. Donna, Mitch, it's probably you two. Look in each other's eyes. And I want you to discuss for 30 seconds, what is a worldview and what does it answer? Better discuss well, because there might be a pop quiz at the end. What is a worldview and what does it answer? Ten seconds. All right, I've got someone volunteered. Clayton, what did you learn about worldview? A lens through which you interpret the world. That's great. I saw some fruitful conversation between John and your wife, Leanne. Sorry. Great. All right. Anyone else have Clay? Sharon? Way you view a world. How about the questions that it should answer? Do you want to get onto that? All right, Eddie?
Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is our purpose?
Great. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What's our purpose, Richard? Are people fundamentally good or bad? That's a huge question that we have today. So I don't even know that I need to teach this next part because you all got it. Worldviews are a lens through which we view the world. That was great, Clayton. Good job. And it really answers some of these basic questions. What is really real? Philosophy, we call that metaphysics. Okay, that's the big word. But that's just, you can understand that. What can we know? How do we come about knowing that? Philosophy, we call that epistemology. What actions are right and wrong, and how do we know what they are? So although philosophers and probably apologists tend to talk about worldview, everyone has a worldview, whether you're thinking about it or not. In fact, you can't really be a functioning human without a worldview of some sort. If you're in a coma, you don't have a worldview. But if you're out and about, then you have a worldview. Some people might even ask, is the physical universe real? That seems kind of a silly question to us. Does it exist? But if you were a member of a religion like Hinduism or Buddhism or some American Indian religions, you would think, of course the world isn't really real. This is just a dream. We are in the dream of God, and we're trying to escape this world. So what might seem common sense to us is not common sense to someone else. And so you probably all said, common sense isn't common. That's a way of saying we don't all share the same worldview. We have different worldviews on what's going on. Other questions that a worldview might answer: where did I come from? I think I heard that. How do I relate to other people? How do I relate to animals? Do I have a duty to protect, care for animals? Can I eat animals? Plants, how do I relate to my environment? Why am I here? Does life have any purpose or meaning? What happens when I die? I think all of y'all hit on these. All right, so that's a worldview, and you'll hear Jonathan and I ask this question lots of times. Okay, but so what? What do we get from that? Well, even with these guys on the screen, and for us, sometimes our stated answer to a question isn't actually how we live our life. So there's a famous story of Francis Schaeffer talking to a Buddhist, and the Buddhist was saying, there's no right and wrong, all of this is imaginary, and Francis Schaeffer has a boiling pot of water, and he goes over. He doesn't actually do it, but he feigns about to pour this boiling pot of water on this Buddhist, and his real world view comes to light. Because if it's just a dream, it doesn't matter if he gets this boiling hot water poured on him. That's wrong, you shouldn't do that to me, that's going to cause pain. Okay, your real world view came to the surface. So sometimes our stated answers, even as Christians, to what we believe isn't how we live out our life. Take, for example, someone who says, I love the environment, I want to watch over it. But then those same people may litter or dump their motor oil out, all right? There's a conflict between their stated worldview and how they are living that worldview out. All right, and so I remember, is Chris Hawken here? I think he's probably doing final preps for worship service, but he and I traveled up 26, basically as far as 26 goes. I think that we came to the end of 26. I think it was Johnson City, North Carolina, perhaps, I don't know. But we went to this conference called the Truth Project. This was years ago, and Del Tackett was leading it, and he ended asking, do you really believe that what you believe is really real? Are you going to live out what you claim to believe in the Bible? So we want to be able to not only evaluate worldviews in this class, but to say, hey, how are we called to, as Jonathan said, step into the predominant worldview and help make some changes. For a society, now we're going to kind of transition talking about a society as a whole. In order for a society to function, there must be some core pieces of a worldview that we all share together. We can tolerate some differences, but when we have so many differences that we have these fundamental clashings, it's hard to have a well-melded culture. Case in point, Mormonism popped up on the scene in the 1800s. There's a lot of things that Mormons do well, especially today, maybe less so back then. But we did not, as a society, allow them to engage in polygamy. We said, no, you cannot practice that part of your worldview because we have to have a melding worldview together. So we're going to talk about how do we help, see that together? How do we meld that together? All right, so 2 questions that we asked that we said we're going to try to cover today. What is a worldview? Hopefully we've covered that. Hopefully you have a good idea of what a worldview is, how it might inform you of how you live your everyday actions. Now we're going to start kind of building in some of that historical worldview of how did we get here? And it's going to go back to Rome, ancient Rome. Maybe you've seen, this question like these girls asking their boyfriends, how often do you think of ancient Rome? And they're like, maybe once a week, and like they're astonished, but that's maybe not once a week for me, but it's often that you think, oh, that relates to ancient Rome. So we're going to talk, because a lot of how we behave every day, whether you realize it or not, has its roots in ancient Rome. And this is a picture I've shown you many times. Anyone remember what this picture is? Richard? These are all philosophers painted by Raphael, and I have used it to emphasize the struggle between these 2 primary philosophers. This is Plato on my right, your left, and Aristotle on the other side, okay? And you can see their hand gestures. How are they gesturing? Plato's pointing up, Aristotle's pointing down. And this was a huge divide. I get excited about it. I mean, y'all are like, well, yeah. But this is a huge divide in worldviews. This is worldviews in conflict. So there's ways that we can talk about it, but succinctly, Plato is advocating for an idealism. We'll talk about that. Aristotle is advocating for realism. I think the best way to highlight that is to show you a picture I took in Ellijay, Georgia, and sent it to Donnie, because that's my hand. Now, I don't have the hugest hands, but I don't have small hands either. That leaf is bigger than my hand. Like you can see, that's a huge leaf. And we were like, this is a crazy leaf. But I was like, Donnie, what type of tree is this? And he said, well, it could be a couple of trees, but it's definitely in the, does anyone know? Clayton, you should know this, right? What type of? It's in the oak, white or red? I'm going to just put you on the spot. Red oak. Very good, Clayton. And how did you know that, Clayton? Yeah, it's got pointy spines. So red oak has pointy ends, white oak has smooth ends, but there's more than just red and white. Those are just classes of trees, right? So Donnie is like narrowing this down, but I guarantee that there's no other leaf on that tree that looked exactly like that leaf, right? They're all a little bit different. And if we went to another red oak tree, they would all be a little bit different. You could tell the difference. And maybe we went to a white oak tree, or maybe a crepe myrtle, or maybe fill in the blank. But when I say leaf, all of you know what I'm talking about, even though none of them are the same, right? How can I say the word leaf and everyone knows what a leaf is? How does that work? That is a philosophical question. How could I say tree and everyone knows what a tree is, even though your exact pictures of a tree is different? Okay, so that is the divide. Plato would say we know that can work because there is this ideal leaf out there, abstract, that all of these leaves are kind of in a shadowy way exhibiting. So there is an ideal table out there. There's an ideal tree. And the nature of that comes down, and these physical objects imbue that. And that is why it's called idealism, because this leaf is exhibiting the ideal leaf out there, okay? Aristotle was like, crazy talk. And I think most of us today would say that's crazy talk. Aristotle would say, we see this leaf, this leaf, this leaf, this leaf, this leaf, this leaf. Say that a bunch of times, it's hard. We see all of these leaves, and we abstract from that what it is to be a leaf. We abstract from the real, kind of this general term that we can apply to most of them. So idealism and realism. Okay, but so what? Like, that was interesting, Michael, but let's connect that. Well, the Roman Empire was largely on Plato's side. They believed in idealism. And so they had the one that they would call. The one was this spirit body who didn't create, didn't have anything, and there were all of these level of gradations between the one down to, at the end, dirt. So the one was good, transcendent, ineffable, you could never know it. The one reflected himself, became a hypercosmic God, who reflected himself, became a demiurge. The demiurge was actually the creator. The creator created the cosmic gods, those gods that you might think of like Poseidon, Zeus, all of those folks. Those gods acted on this physical world. Then you get humans, then you get animals, and you get plants, and you get dirt. And all of these things are reflecting these ideas that are kind of in the one, right? And it's very hierarchical, so that the higher you go up on this, the closer you are to the one, the higher you are as a level of being. Everyone tracking so far? All right, well, so what? That's the question again. Well, humans, and dare I say, free citizen male humans, right, were the highest thing that you could come in interact with in the Roman Empire. So if for me, I would be just below God. And I think my family, they understand that. They see that too. As the father of my house, and I'm a free citizen of the state, basically what I said was the law, right? I was in charge eminently of my household. If I wanted to kill one of my children, I mean, there's God and then there's Michael, right? Right. So that's how they viewed things. That greatly impacted their society. It was a pervasive way of thinking. So if I want to not have this child, just leave it out in the cold, right? If I want to participate in some very gross immorality, that's okay. He's right below God. So that is the kind of the foundation of the Roman society. And that's why this picture, if I could scroll back, is so huge. What is really real? What is going on? Yeah, Eddie? Oh, no. For us, it was gross immorality, but for them, it wouldn't be. Okay, so that kind of gives us a starting playing field for a worldview, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan.
Our only other question for today was, what is this prevailing worldview in Rome? And Michael started to kind of get us there by giving us that foundation. And so let's just talk about some of the aspects of what it really would have been like to be in Rome. So the dominant worldview in that first century Rome is what Michael was talking about. It's Neoplatonism. Everything emanates from the one in these different little shadows all the way down to different levels of being. And the closer you are to the one, the more valuable you are. Your value depends on, are you close enough to that spiritual realm, or are you just kind of down here somewhere below as one of those shadows of shadows of shadows? So for us to think about this, we'll talk about pagan religions. And I would say most pagan religions of the ancient world focused on some hierarchy of mostly agricultural deities. They're responsible for crops, for weather, for fertility, for hunting, for travel. And worship generally consisted of appeasing these multiple deities so that they would leave you alone. Like so that you could go about your business, so that the rain would fall. You try to appease these deities and not be a target for one of these gods. Lots and lots of Greek poets and Roman poets wrote stories about people who made themselves targets of the gods. So if you think of Homer and the story of the Odyssey, he irritated a lot of gods. And it took him years and years to get back home because he was going overseas, and the god of the sea was irritated with him. And so it was this problem that was recurring for them. Worship for these gods ranged from animal sacrifice to pouring out drink offerings to burning incense to human sacrifice to sexual acts in temples. For most religions, for these pagan religions, there was no real concern of like a personal relationship with the deity. In fact, you really didn't want a personal relationship with these deities. You wanted them to stay over there, be happy with the drink offering you just poured out, and leave you alone. As Rome shifted from a republic to an empire, emperor worship also became an important religious component, and they just sort of added it into the plethora of other gods that they worshiped. The emperor was the closest you could be on earth to the one. He was the closest, he was the highest to that spiritual realm, and so anybody that didn't worship him was seen as a traitor, and that meant torture and death for most of them. Interestingly, the Jews in the first century and a little bit before that had a special dispensation from Rome where they did not have to worship the emperor. It's an interesting little carve-out that the Jews managed to get for themselves. Ancestor worship was also very regular with small shrines in homes. Michael, as the god of his family, if he passed away, they would make a little shrine in their home and burn incense to Michael's spirit to make sure that they're still keeping him happy. For Rome, by the time of the empire, that's several decades before Jesus' birth, human sacrifice had fallen out of really common practice, but that doesn't mean that the value of human life had changed. It doesn't mean all of a sudden Rome started valuing human life as such. And we can see that in a couple of other ways. We see that the low value of human life in something like the games. Now, we're all probably familiar with the gladiator games that went on in the Colosseum and in different kind of spots and sports arenas throughout Rome, where slaves and prisoners were brought out to fight other slaves or trained fighters or animals. And some were offered the chance to earn their freedom by being successful in this. But y'all, live death was the spectacle du jour. And we don't think about that enough, I think. Well, maybe Michael and I think about Rome a little bit more often, but we don't think about just how barbaric that is, but I think there's a reason for that. As a side note, we think we're so much more advanced than Rome today, but if you look at what sells for popular entertainment today, if you look at movies and TV shows, our inclinations are not different from the Romans because it comes out of a sin nature. If you transported somebody from first century Rome to today and showed them an episode of Game of Thrones, they would look at that, and our graphics, our effects have gotten so good, they would look at that and just think, I'm watching live death again, just like I was over there. Our movies and TV shows fulfill that same basic thing, that same desire for violence. So another way that we see them devaluing human life is, speaking of slaves that were so often in the Colosseum, a huge percentage of the Roman population were slaves, either resulting from the expanding empire or from indentured servitude due to economic hardship. Very many lower-class Roman citizens had to indenture themselves to other people, say, I'll be your slave for this amount of time, please just make sure I have enough to eat, because the economic conditions were dire. Rome is one of a few empires in history that's considered a slave empire because of its 20% or more population of slaves, and the entire infrastructure was built on those slaves and built by those slaves. So it functioned for their society. That was the only way for them to function once they got to that critical mass of how many slaves they had in their culture. Michael mentioned the social hierarchy. As Roman Republic expanded further, some of the ideas of the Greeks really made this impact. That's what he's talking about, Neoplatonism, especially that hierarchy of being. Those of high blood or powerful position were seen as objectively superior to others. Right, the lowest on the totem pole would be slaves and women and children, and the citizen men would be at the top of that list. And the closer you are up to the top of the social hierarchy, the more moral authority you had. So the Greek, this Greek ideology kind of kept perforating through this Roman culture, and this Greek dualism of spirit over matter, spirit is good, matter doesn't matter, caused the Romans of higher class to pursue just luxury. Every opportunity they had. They built wonderful things. They lived their lives for luxury. Because what better way to contemplate the immaterial than to be around pleasures, be around the good, be around beauty. Women had little to no rights in this republic and early empire. And in fact, as Michael said, a man had utter authority over his household up to the point of death for his family members. Abortion was extremely normal. This was a highly sexualized culture, but reproduction was not at the top of the list. In their highly sexualized culture, children were often seen as problematic. So Roman families would keep as many boys as they had. They would normally keep one daughter, and then every other daughter that was born to them, they would dispose of. And they found, in excavations, they have found hundreds and hundreds of babies' skeletons in the sewers under Roman bathhouses, because they would literally take the babies and just flush them down. That value of human life did not exist because they were so far from the one. They were on the very bottom of the totem pole. So in Rome, to summarize, people were at the mercy of impersonal gods to whom they needed to appease, and they were also required to worship the emperor. People were stuck in a social hierarchy that held women, children, and slaves at the very bottom of the pile. It allowed the people at the top to have complete moral authority. There was reckless abandon to sensual pleasures in the upper classes, and abortion and infanticide were so common that a huge percentage of young women that were mistresses of important people were actually sterilized by the processes they would use for abortion. And if the baby did come to term, well, they leave it out, like Michael said, in the cold to die on its own. And all of this mess comes from worldview level questions. Everything that we've talked about in Rome, the situation that it was, comes from their answers to worldview level questions. What is good, true, and right? What is life for? The way they answered those questions changed everything about their culture. So we would say this, the so what for us today. Worldview matters. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. What answers we hold at the core of our being for these important questions will determine our thoughts and actions in life. And so as Christians, we want to examine ourselves carefully. Do we hold the right answers for those big questions? That's a number one question. Do we have the right answers for those questions? And are these beliefs rooted in Scripture, not just our culture and not just tradition, but in Scripture? And do we allow our faith to impact every area of our life, or do we have a compartment for it? The second thing is that the church has work to do. Chuck Colson wrote, "The church's singular failure in recent decades has been the failure to see Christianity as a life system, as a worldview that governs every area of existence." Abraham Kuyper, great 19th century Dutch theologian, said this, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" That should be the heart of the believer. Every square inch of our existence, Christ says, "Mine." And so our responsibility is to reflect Him in every square inch of our life. So Christian faith is personal, but it is not private. A follower of Jesus cannot and must not live without ripples. A Christian life should send ripples out into the culture. True faith has a redeeming impact on culture. So as we step through the centuries from Christ's birth to our births, we're going to be encouraged by the way faithful Christians have impacted Western culture for the glory of Christ. And we should feel challenged to enter our own part of that mission. Because if you're a follower of Jesus, this is part of your mission too. What Christians have done throughout the centuries, entering culture, seeing what's broken and where we can bring healing, seeing what's missing that we can provide, this is the work of Christians. Next week, we will see how the earliest followers of Christ did that in Rome, and it's going to blow your mind. Let's pray.